got tickets. We got tickets.
Saverio? Allora, ci siamo. Okay. Come? Sì, mi faccio come la possibilità. Non vede mai. Ma questo lo posso abbassare, no? Non serve.
È importante che la porta che si chiude quando
So we can start. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 12th edition of our conference, the International Workshop on Applied Economics of Education. After 2 years, we're back in person, finally, and it's a pleasure to see many of you here. We had to cancel the 11th edition, as you know, in 2020 because of the pandemic, and last year we had only an online conference. Although it went well, the experience naturally was not comparable to our usual conferences in person, where we also have the possibility to interact, meet your colleagues, old friends, and enjoy the location. In the last 2 years, many issues and problems of the educational system have been exacerbated by the pandemics. The public health concerns have steadily been at the center of the government policies, correctly in the first days of the pandemic, but at the expenses, at least in Italy, of the educational policies. Online teaching with empty classes at school and empty lecture theaters in the university is not a sign of modernization, but it's a rather sign of weakening. And we'll probably discuss here in the future, in another edition, the long-term effects of the current effects on the current course of students. I think the positive innovation that comes from the technology can only complement and simplify our work in academia. Indeed, we are also on streaming, but it cannot substitute our physical presence. And this year, your strong participation, I would say, around 80 participants from prestigious universities all over Europe and around the world. It's probably one of our peak. It's actually a reassurance that we can still keep academia very alive. So, Calabria, Catanzaro is once again at the center of the economics of education debate. This year we received around 140 submissions. The quality of the papers I, Colin, myself, the program committee, and we already thanked, and we'll thank again. We had a tough and challenging time to select the best 60-65 papers between contributed and poster session, and I'm sorry we could not fit in the program some other good paper. However, we plan to have the 13th edition, so there will still be time. At the end, we think we have a final program of good quality, rich and very intense. First of all, let me thank the three keynote speakers, Susanna Lowe, then Sandra, okay, and Chris. Thanks a lot for accepting our invitation, being here. I hope you will enjoy the conference. And our conference is mainly self-financed. However, half of the costs are covered by the important contribution of Magna Grecia University, partly from the Department of Law, Economics and Sociology. The director sends you his regards, and also there is some help from the departmental officer that I would like to thank Mr. Labanca and his staff. And another contribution comes from the director, who today is not physically in Catanzaro, otherwise he would have been here to welcome you. He told me to send his regards. He has always been very sympathetic towards our conference, and every time I meet him, he emphasizes with all his reason, medical doctor, emphasize our success. So this conference is also organized in collaboration with the Lancaster University, where I'm also affiliated, and TNU, where Colin is located. And for the last 20 years, Colin has assiduously worked with me to make this conference the most well-known in the economics of education para. And let me thank Emanuela Macri for her important help for the last 10 years. So going back to the program, we have 6 parallel sessions and 2 poster sessions. We have a tough Monday and a relatively lighter Tuesday. Following the first keynote lecture, there will be during the day 3 parallel sessions and 1 poster session. And then at 5:30 we have the last second keynote lecture. Then some technical information. I will take from here to go to the gala dinner. We may stop on request at the palace as well. Tomorrow we have 3 parallel sessions and 1 poster session, and we finish with the third keynote lecture. Then, for those who want, we'll go to a tour and then a pizza, but you need to sign because I need to know the numbers. Then, for further information, it would be Manuela, Francesco, you met yesterday at the airport. So to thank him for all the work from the morning to the late night. Colin, myself, you have the detail of the program, and this is the main room where we will have the poster session and keynote lectures. So I hope you will enjoy the conference, and thanks a lot, thanks again for coming. Okay, thanks. So now we can start with our works, with our first keynote speaker. Susanna Loeb, a PhD in economics from the University of Michigan. Then she started her career at Stanford up to Barnett Family Professor in 2011. And then she was the founding director of the Center for Education Policy. From 2018, now is a professor of education, international public affairs at Brown University, and director of the Amberg Institute at Brown. She's also the founder and active executive director of the National Student Support Accelerator. Her research interests focus on education policy and its role in improving educational opportunities for students, but also issues related to educator career choices, school finance, governments, and early childhood system. She has an extensive list of publications, just to quote something, Area, Strategy, Bar, Jolly, Child, and many others. So today's talk is, I will put it on scaling promising practice, the case of high-impact tutoring in response to pandemic-induced student needs. You have 50 minutes, but I need to upload the presentation first.
Colin and Giuseppe, thanks for having me here. It's really a pleasure, and it's such a treat to be here, and thanks all of you for listening to this. So I'm going to try to talk today really about how we take our research and make it useful for decision making, and then build a research agenda that responds to kind of immediate needs. And in this case, well, it's about high impact tutoring in response to the pandemic. Let's see if I can both hold this and press this and talk at the same time. I'm not sure. Okay, no, I can't, because that didn't work. Oh, I can turn it on. Okay. See, here we go. Okay, so as many of of you know, the COVID pandemic affected students a lot. So this is a graph, this is from US data, but McKinsey put this together, which is, you know, the big consulting firm there. And you can see by taking a look at what the actual achievement was relative to what would have been expected, they estimate that students on average lost about 5 months of learning in math and about 4 months of learning in ELA as a result of the pandemic. And that was from when it started really in 2020 until May of 2021. I like this graph a lot, not that it shows something good, but that I feel like it's you know, kind of, it really points to what was going on. What it does is it breaks students into quartiles by their, or quintiles by their initial achievement level, and sees what the gain was for different achievement levels during that time relative to what they predicted would have been. So this is like 3rd to 5th grade, 4th to 6th grade, and this is during the pandemic versus before. And what's so interesting is if you look at this, which is reading, you can see that the high achieving kids, the median is about the same as the median, or actually even a little higher. In math, it's lower, but it's still at the kind of 45, 40 percentile for the high achieving kids. But the kids who started out low achieving really lost a lot. So the median is at the 39th percentile of gains over that time period. And this is based on millions of kids. And in math, it's even worse. You see the 26th percentile, the 32nd percentile. The results are really concentrated in low achieving kids and poor kids, in kids from kind of minoritized groups, so Black and Hispanic kids. Okay, so what do you do as a result of this? We do a lot of research. We get to a point where there's a real problem. It's helpful to go back and take a look at the research. So we basically scan the research base. I work a little bit with folks at JPAL, and we all did a bunch of this. And as it turns out, there's only one kind of intervention that's been studied a lot that really helps kids who are behind catch up. And that is in relatively intensive tutoring. And it's not that there's just like one study of it. There are about 150 random control trials of different kinds of intensive tutoring. And this is just kind of showing the effects of different studies. And there's, you know, 6 out of many of these that found negative effects. But the vast majority really find large positive effects. Which isn't typical, as you know, of the kinds of interventions that we study. There have been 7 meta-analyses in the last 5 years. The most recent one was Mikau, Oriopoulos, and Kwan, this is also a JPAL one. And, but you can see they cover different grade levels and different, either reading or math. And I converted their findings into months. And the reason before was effect sizes. Effect sizes are really, really hard for tests. It seems like it should be a good thing to compare effect sizes. But in fact, because kids learn about 1/3 of a standard deviation over a year when they're in early elementary school, but less than 1/10 of a standard deviation in high school, you've got very different months of learning associated with effect sizes at different grade levels. So we turned it into months of learning. And what you can see is that you get a lot of months of learning out of a year of this kind of approach. Okay, and it's more effective than other kinds of approaches that there is evidence for, like class size reduction, professional development for teachers. It's not like you don't need good schools, but if you're talking about how to take a small group of kids and move them forward, tutoring is the one that really stands out. Okay, so it's not necessarily surprising that this is a positive, that we find positive effects. In the US in 2020, there was $47 billion invested in tutoring, largely by parents buying tutoring for their kids, so for high income kids. I actually think it's one of our big sources of inequality in educational access is whether or not kids who are having trouble get access to an adult that helps them get over it. And there is a lot of investment by parents going into this. It also has a basic logic, which is that instead of having to take like a whole class again, the tutor can target student needs. And also you have like a responsibility and a sense of support from an individual relationship that kind of can build engagement. So there are lots of reasons to think that this kind of approach is good, in addition to like a lot of research, like the kind of research that we do. But not all tutoring is effective. So during the No Child Left Behind era, which was started in 2001, schools in the US, if they failed to meet annual yearly progress, so if they were considered troubled schools, then parents were allowed to, and for 2 years in a row, parents were allowed to opt into free tutoring. So they did try to put this in scale. It was kind of a stick, so it was a bad thing, and the schools didn't really like that this was where the money was going. But nonetheless, they did try to do this. Parents didn't take it up very much, and overall, it didn't really have any effect on, like, large-scale effect on kids. There is some, Carolyn Heinrich did some study where she found that it seemed to have some positive effects where there were minimum dosage requirements. You had to have a certain amount. It was more structured sessions, but overall NCLB didn't work very well. Okay, so our question was, we have a lot of evidence of the effects of tutoring, but how can we scale this and hold on to quality? Okay, so this is the first part of kind of taking the evidence, finding something to do, but see that it's not that easy to scale, so what do we do? So the first thing we did was to try to understand what it takes to scale. This is a research base that is not very strong. Okay, so I'm gonna give you, and I'm gonna write this up even though I haven't written it up yet, it's in notes, so this is kind of not our typical kind of research working paper. But like if you read the research on scaling, to me, it falls into these kind of 4 buckets of things that affect whether things can scale. The intervention, communication about the intervention, implementation capacity, and then the policy and economic environment. I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about this because when we're thinking about taking the research and figuring out how to scale, it's good to think about what do you need in order to scale something. Sometimes you think, oh, well, you can take something and just say, here is a better curriculum, so I'm going to scale it, and a policy can come in and scale a curriculum or something like that. In the US, at least, education is really decentralized. You've got lots and lots of people making a decision about what happens, and so it's actually a more complicated process to actually go in and see something scale. Though things have scaled. Like there's a kind of care in hospitals, which a bunch of this research is going to come from, where it's palliative care. So it's kind of like, it's very supportive care for people, but instead of, it used to be just for people who were very much at the end of life, and then it switched to realizing that it's helpful for people who are going to recover too, to have this kind of intensive supports that go beyond healthcare. It helps them recover. That's really expanded across hospitals in the US, but it took 25 years essentially to expand. Okay, so the first thing is what we all think about when we think about why something scales, and it's basically about the intervention itself. John List just wrote a book about scaling. It's all about the intervention itself. Okay, and this is one part, and it is important. So the intervention has to have a relative advantage over current practice. So it has to be good in order to scale. And that makes sense. And so you want something that's good. It's also important, if it's going to scale, to have compatibility with current practices. Okay, so it's much easier to scale something like a pill and say, well, instead of taking that pill, take this pill, because it doesn't really affect anything. Once what you want to do is like change the human resources in something or shift around schedules or things like that, it's much, much harder. In our case, this is going to turn out to be difficult because it's not necessarily compatible with current practice. And so you think, okay, then it doesn't naturally scale. However, since it's like the only thing we know that can help kids at this point, it's kind of important to think, okay, well, how can we kind of push towards changing current practices so that it can't scale? But anyway, relative advantage and compatibility with current practices kind of predict whether or not something's going to scale relatively quickly. Communication is clearly important, kind of the amount of communication that gets out there. It's like I always think, look, I wrote this great paper, but wait, there's no change, and no one's ever read any of the paper that I wrote saying that you should do this. Well, it's because, so much of what we do, and we see it, some people are so good in our work about getting out on social media with their stuff, and that really matters. Like how much, even if it might be cringy to do a lot of promotion actually is how you get some change going on. It also depends on people that other people trust. So who are the opinion leaders? And you can think like, I don't know, the president or somebody, or a celebrity or something like that could be good at this. But there's also like for people who are making the decision, there may be specific groups that matter for communication. So for example, principals are gonna make a lot of decisions. School head teachers, lead teachers are gonna make a lot of decisions. They pay attention to other lead teachers, particularly of schools that are doing very well, or schools in the neighborhood and they've somehow gotten respect. So getting to those decision makers is useful. Okay, you've got the intervention, communication, and then implementation capacity. So there's both this issue that when you make changes in schools, it's almost always going to be done first in the schools that actually can, have their act together. And that's going to be really important and really different. So we, for example, there's some schools, either both in the traditional public schools or in the charter sector, that just are a lot more flexible, a lot more willing to try things. They're going to do things, but there's also like support for implementation. Sometimes groups come in and actually help places make transitions that are needed to put this in. Okay, so those are the things that communication and implementation capacity go beyond the intervention. And then of course, there's the policy and economic environment. Since I can't affect that quite so much, but a little bit, I don't have very much there that I've written about yet, but it's, when cell phones came in, the building of towers was very important for their use, right? So that there's policy things that can do that really affect what goes on. Right now, the economic environment where the labor market is so tight is really an issue in scaling of tutoring. Okay, so anyway, given this, basically what we came to the conclusion is that we needed research on the intervention. So there's lots of research that says this program is effective. Again, about 150 RCTs, but we don't know exactly what it is about programs. So the first thing we are going to do is kind of take a look at the research and say what's common in those programs, but it's not like it's a test. For example, it doesn't look like volunteers are very good, but volunteers tend to be in programs that are super unstructured and doesn't have all this other thing. So maybe you could make use of volunteers. So we need research about the intervention and about how to implement. We can actually use tools and technical assistance that can help in implementing this as this goes on. So how do you help the schools make the kinds of changes that they need? For communication, you need to have some direct communication out there. And then for the policy and economic environment, there's a bunch of kind of advocacy that you can do as well as research. Okay. So we designed something called the National Student Support Accelerator to try to do this. And the first thing we did was an initial research summary that would drive these tools. Like, what do we know about what makes good tutoring? And again, we don't have any real tests of exactly the characteristics, but we do have a lot of programs that have shown effects. And so we can look at those programs and see what they look like. And using that, we created both kind of a summary of the research and what we need to know, and then tools for state policymakers for what they would need to know for what our best guess is. You are never going to be in a point in research where we know exactly what to do, but it's hard to believe that we can have effects on what goes on unless we simplify what we learn from our research so that it's put in a language that people who are making the decisions can understand. And so for us, we did this little thing, which now I look at it and say, okay, well, that's not so easy to understand either. But basically taking the research and seeing what are the common among many of the programs, what we found is they tended to have high quality materials. They tended to be a lot. So 3+ times a week for 30 to 60 minutes, there'd be tutors. with a 3-to-1, 2-to-1, or 1-to-1 ratio. So they tended to have small ratios and quite a bit of tutoring. The tutor tended to be consistent and well supported, so it was the same person meeting with the students, so you can have a relationship develop, and there was supervision of the tutors just in case they weren't doing well or they could do better and they could get help. It tended to use data to drive instruction. Like we think, oh, a student can come and tell us what they don't know. That is not a very good assumption. Most students don't know what they don't know, except maybe in math when they have a problem that they can't solve. But it's very hard to know that. And so the benefit of tutoring is it can target students where they need help, and so they need to use data to do it. It's helpful if it's embedded in schools. The ones that are most effective tend to be during the school day. A lot so that students can will show up. It's like hard to get students to show up when it's not the school day. And then some things about kind of making sure it is, the tutor can relate to the student and that you're getting the students who need it the most. Okay, so this is what we did to kind of help move it along. And we made a bunch of tools, like 100-page documents for programs wanting to start up. What would you do? Or districts wanting to start up. And anyway, so that's not so relevant for us here, which is more research, but I just wanted to point out that we did this. This would be an example of this playbook for districts or for programs where it would start with identifying, I guess this is the district one, what you wanted to do tutoring in, how you plan for it, designing it, measuring the impact and following it up. So these are just, I wanted to put this here because I think sometimes, again, we think that our findings are knowledge that is used, but it's actually kind of, there's this difference between the findings of the research and the practical knowledge that decision makers use. And I think we're in a really good position in some ways because we've thought so much about the questions to make that translation, and we don't do it very much. So this was kind of cool for me because I've never really spent time doing this either. But we produced this, and then states in the US took it up. We branded it with them. They got it out to all their districts. And we ended up, having a lot of places around the US follow this kind of made up kind of things that tutoring should be like. Okay, and then we did a bunch of engagement. We worked with the teachers' unions, actually. You would think that maybe tutoring wouldn't be something that the unions would be in favor of, but in fact, teachers are super kind of overworked and stressed out right now and would really like to give their students individual attention, and it's pretty much hard to do that if you've got a class of 30 or 25 to do this kind of stuff. And so we've had a lot of support from the unions putting together a tutor advisory group, and then similar things for other groups. Then on research, okay, so basically we took research and did all those things, but then what we wanted to do is say, what's the next step in research that we can use to kind of to know what we should do at this moment. And there are 4 kinds of research that we're working on. And the first is the test of key features. So as I was saying, we don't know exactly what works, and some of these things have very big cost implications. So we can say from research that most of the programs that have been effective have had less than, have had a ratio of 1, 2, or 3 kids per tutor. But the difference between 1 and 3 kids per tutor is a really big difference in cost, right? It's a tripling almost of the cost. And so really understanding the trade-offs in something like that is important. So the second thing is a test of program effects. Now, it's good to, we have so many, we have 150 of these kinds of things, but we don't have any really in the US of virtual tutoring. The two studies have just come out, one from Italy and one from Spain, on virtual tutoring during the pandemic. That some of you may know, that is kind of the basis for saying that tutoring can work virtually as well. But there are other kinds of things like programs that combine computer-assisted learning with individualized instruction kind of stuff that might be useful as well. Then there's research that we don't normally do, but it's basically to understand this scaling stuff. So we see that it's got stuff about the implementation, for example, but we don't know what the barriers are. And if we knew what the barriers are, then we could figure out kind of what is needed to make this kind of change. If you want to take the economic research and say, okay, well, how do we change it? We have to know what is getting in the way of changing. And so that's the understanding scaling kind of research. And then the last, which is cool, I really like, is that because so much of this during the pandemic has been virtual, we now have video and audio data of every interaction between a student and an educator in a way we've never had it before. So you can imagine that with things like natural language processing, we can understand, what tutors do, educators do, maybe it will translate to teachers too, that affect whether students engage and then affect their learning, because we've never really had this. We've had 20-minute observations of teachers or something like that, that someone has classified, but we've never had this kind of intensive data. So I really love this stuff, and we've got a group that's starting to do this. I'm not going to talk about that today, but it is a kind of new kind of data research that I think has a lot of potential, because you can, you have both things that you think matter, like does the tutor build on what the student says, that you can go in and see, but you can also use predictive analytics really in a very open-ended way to see what affects student outcomes. So I want to do a quick thing on understanding scaling, and then because we're at the kind of conference, if I have time, I'm going to do one of our test of key features. Okay, so for understanding scaling, we have created research practice partnerships. This is not just me. We have someone who does the research, creates these, but with districts around the US. And the reason that we've tried to get them East Coast, West Coast, North, a little bit South, big, small, rural, urban kinds of districts to try to understand what issues they're running into in scale. What we're trying to look at is facilitators and barriers. What are helping districts try to put this in? Many districts, so I guess the context is the federal government gave a lot of money to schools, $120 billion. More than 20 billion of it was supposed to go to evidence-based programs that can help accelerate student learning. Tutoring and and kind of summer school are the two things that districts are doing. So there is a lot of interest in the US in improving, in like trying to get this done. So we're looking at facilitators and barriers. We're looking at conditions outside the district control. So what are things that are going on at the state level, for example, that could affect whether the districts are implementing this? What features of are there some things about tutoring programs that are easier or harder to implement, so that we know why districts are doing part of what we think is effective, but not another part? And then who are they aiming the studies for? And then this isn't the most clean, but we're also doing basically, who's getting the tutoring, what's happening with their achievement and attendance and things like that, and the best that we can do at the causal effects without RCTs. The other part I'll talk about, the RCTs. Okay, so we have about 100 plus interviews so far and documents, and so I'll just tell you a couple of the things that we're finding in this qualitative research. And I think it shows, we don't do very much qualitative research. I hardly do any of it, but there's really no way of understanding these things without actually going to the district and figuring out what they're doing. And so there's some reasons for what we do that it's useful to get this kind of information. And so basically what we found is that, this is the data we're collecting. I can skip. We've got interviews, documents, administrative data, and then we've run pulse checks of tutors and students while they put their tutoring in. So the initial results, basically there's a really broad belief among educators that this is the right thing to do for students. And so that's really helping move this forward. But it's not so easy to move forward. And in particular, everybody's exhausted right now because of COVID. But the big issues are scheduling. The fact that in order to get kids with a tutor during the school day, you have to switch your schedules around. That doesn't seem like a big deal, but it's a really big deal in schools. Administrative processes, I think we'll be able to get over them, but right now, just like procurement, like contracts and things like that, background checks are a big thing, and then tutor supply. So the labor markets are really making this difficult. The conditions, the federal funding has been amazing. So that's one of the reasons things are going so well. The availability of providers, it varies across states, and those kinds of things affect what's going on. And this, I'm just giving you some examples. So the feature implementation, like they actually feel very comfortable as schools with selecting, training, and in most cases, oversight of tutors. They feel like low ratios, so 1-to-1, 1-to-2, and as much as we're thinking they should have it each week, it's hard for them to do, but they believe in it. So it's that's not really that much of an issue. They're willing to do that. The stuff that actually turns out to be harder is having it be during the school day. So they're like, yeah, no, we'll try it after school and things like that. And then data linked to materials to get to the tutors. So that's just because it's a infrastructure thing that they don't have. Okay, and equity. All districts in theory want it to be available to kids who need it the most. Most are making it available through just to kids who are below a threshold on test scores, but there are some districts that are just saying, well, we're making this available in kind of an opt-in basis to all kids. And that's how we're going to get it to the kids who need it the most, is just that we're making it available to all kids. That's what I'm going to show you in RCT, or a study of with more real, with kind of number data. Okay, so that's understanding scaling. It's continuing to go on, but I wanted to point this out. I know it's not the kind of research that we normally do, but it is actually really central to trying to take our research and make it have an effect. Okay, so the last thing is the test of key features. With each of the districts that we're working in, one of the things that they've agreed to do is a kind of A/B test with us. So we're doing these little RCTs in each of these school districts. So in Providence, we're randomizing tutors to students and looking at kind of gender match. And we wanted to look at race match, but we can't because there's not enough variation. We're looking at different kinds of supports for tutors, so different kinds of pre-service and during service coaching and training. We're doing some ratios, students per tutor in a large CMO, charter school management, and in Dallas. This is this opt-in stuff I'm going to talk about. Coordinate, whether the tutors coordinate with teachers, and we're testing a bunch of things. And I really like this one. It's not quite underway yet, but I think one of the things is, do you need a consistent tutor? My read of the research is very much that this is driven by the relationship, that the reason this works is because you get a close relationship with the student. But a lot of people are kind of drawn to large-scale solutions that don't include that, whether it's computer-assisted learning or something else. And so I really like the idea of testing the same tutor each time versus varying the tutor. I just have to get that one going. Okay, so now I wanted to, let's just see, I don't know how to know time. I'm going to give you kind of a study that we did. Opt-in, this isn't my favorite of all of them, but we did it first. So this was done right during the pandemic. The outcomes aren't great, but I think it's still a really interesting study. Okay, so during the 2021 academic year for the spring, there's a group of charter schools in the US called Aspire Public Schools. They're in California. And they chose to partner with an on-demand tutoring program that has very well-trained tutors. It's one-on-one. It's a potential for high dosage because the students can take it up as much as they want to. It's done in 4 languages. It's actually really nice. Like, you can upload your paper and they give you back comments on the paper in a very productive way. They're very high quality tutors, but it is on demand and it's virtual and chat based. So it's they type to each other. So this gave us an opportunity to learn kind of who takes up tutoring. Don't think of the RCT right now. So if you give tutoring, our concern was that more engaged students would take it up. So you get higher achieving students, otherwise kind of more engaged students doing it, and it would not be equity enhancing. It would almost be the opposite. And so we wanted to really look at that. And we also wanted to know whether is it going to be effective. Okay, so we have 3 research questions. So what extent do students take advantage of on-demand tutoring? Resource, is this type of tutoring equalizing basically? Second, can we increase take-up with nudges to students and or to parents? So this is where we're gonna do the RCT because it was just like, so when you're working, when you're working with districts during this time period and everything is so crazy, you have to figure out what RCTs you can do that they'll allow you to do. And sometimes they're really good and they'll allow you to do an RCT because they can't give it to all the students, so you give it to half and not the other half, and they're okay with that. But often you have to figure out what you can do that allows them to choose who they give the tutoring to or something like that. And so things like randomizing tutors to students or nudges and stuff like that are much easier to do. Even the trainings for tutors and things like that. So can we increase take-up, and then does take-up of on-demand tutoring lead to student learning gains? And I'm going to show you this lightly because the outcomes, they didn't test during the pandemic, so the outcomes are grades, not grades. Okay. So for increasing take-up, we're just basically going to draw on behavioral science interventions. My read of the literature, I'm not quite sure this is yours as well, is that there is mixed evidence on whether targeting students with reminders and nudges makes any difference. Like students, the nudge literature on students, I don't think is very strong. There's lots of it, but it doesn't show much. It's more promising on parents, that there's more studies showing that you can change parenting behavior. My own view of that is largely because I think nudges work on things that are not central to what we do every day. There are things that are on the side that we might forget to do when we want to do, and so nudging gets us there. Then it's much harder to nudge you through something that you kind of know you have to do but don't want to do. Okay, so there are about 7,000 middle and high school students in this district. 75% are Hispanic, 56% of families indicate Spanish as their primary language. They're almost all eligible for subsidized lunches. They serve a basically low-income Hispanic community in California. We stratify by school, grade, and home language. We took students if they had a home address, which was almost 100% of them. If we had the cell phone number or email address of their parents, and this turns out to be a big one, but we only selected one student within the household, and we just took the other one out of the study, and that reduced our sample to 4,763. I've got how it does it. So we have 4,763 that we did treatment or control. 102 additional ones didn't have parent contact. Info, no address. The sibling assignment is where we lost 1384, and so that's what's here. Okay, so the study design for the randomization part, we had a control group, we had a student-only group, a parent-only group, and a student and parent. And we basically gave them an initial mailer, whoever we were giving it to, and weekly emails or text messages that encouraged them to use it. February 10th, we did our first communication, which was text message and email. The 23rd, we sent the mailers. Then we had these weekly messages. For these weekly messages in week 2 through 6, we randomly assigned different kinds of messages to the different groups so we could test, and we know the take up at each moment, so we could see if that affect take up. This was a total bust. It didn't end up working. Like, it didn't matter what kind of messages we sent for whether they took it up, but I'll tell you what we did anyway, because we thought it was cool while we were doing it, and then we had final communication. So there's both like, do messages matter, and then which kind of messages. So this is an example of the initial mailer. The tutoring provider didn't want us to give their names, so that's why I've got these blue things over the tutoring provider. And we also sent them the little stickies so that they'd have them just at home and it would remind them that way. The basic reminders are Hey Carly, how's your math homework going today? Log in right now to this place to ask a tutor a question you're stuck on. Okay, so we have basic reminders, we have social norms. Carly is the postdoc, Carly Robinson. She was central to basically everything in all of this stuff, but with all the research. But hey Carly, hundreds of Aspire students are getting math help from from the tutoring provider right now. Take that away. From the tutoring provider right now. Be one of them, log into blank right now to ask a tutor a question. So this is the basic social norms, accountability. Hey Carly, your math teacher hopes you'll use this to get homework help and prepare for tests. Your teacher also checks to see if you're logging on or not. Okay, so we tried that. And then valuing. Hey Carly, did you know that students who pass their math class this year are more likely to graduate on time? Okay. So those were the ways. So this is the characteristics of the students by the sample. It's really not very different, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but if you're interested, it's here. It's about 50% female, about 80% free and reduced price, or eligible lunch, which is our measure of poverty, about 55% Spanish speaking. There's a little bit, there are a few Asian, Black, Hispanic, white students, again, 75% Hispanic. And these are some test measures, but we'll get to those. Okay, the balance for randomization worked. Okay, so this is showing that, but it's not very hard to randomize when you're nudging because it's not like people that it's a pretty big thing. So randomization. Okay, so the first question: to what extent do students take advantage of on-demand tutoring, and is it equalizing? The basic answer is no. They don't take much use of it, and it's not equalizing. So we had about 18, this is for the control group, because we didn't want it affected by our intervention, about 19% take it up. And it varied a little bit across grades, but in general, that's about, you get 20% of students who ever log on at all to this, not including the time where the school shows them, they were in an auditorium, they all had to log on and try it. But other than that, did they ever log on again? Of those who logged on, 48% only did one session. So they logged on, but they didn't really do very much of it. 9% logged on for 10 or more sessions. But these sessions were real, so it wasn't that they didn't do anything when they did log on. So the average session or the median session was 33 minutes. And involved 36 exchanges between the tutor and the student. Girls, higher achieving and higher attending students were more likely to log in. Okay, so this isn't, so for female, you have 46, it's 47% never logged on, while 57% logged on at least once. And that's significant. And then if you go down to these, if you didn't fail last year, you were 86% likely to log on if you had no Fs. That's a little weird. Anyway, you're more likely to log on if you had no Fs than you are not to log on. And here, I've got it in a regression format. So here we go. So on average, 12% logged on. If you passed all your courses, you were 10% more likely to log on. That's an easier way of looking at this. Okay, so it's 12% versus 22% essentially logging on based on their prior achievement. Same with attendance, 12% versus 22% if you attended most days. It's also overwhelmingly used for math. Again, math is something kids say, I don't understand this problem, I'm going to get help. This was available in all subjects. They're actually really good at writing and reading stuff. They didn't log on hardly at all for that. It was only almost all what kids can take up, or what kids choose to take up, which is generally like what they're easy, it's easy for them to know they need help. Feel free to ask the question too or interrupt. Do you have a? Take-up did vary a lot across schools. So this is just an indication that schools may have an effect. It's not what we tested here, but there was a lot of variation across schools. Okay, so that's just like the descriptive data. There's low take-up, not affecting many, so you're not affecting many students. It's concentrated in high performers and high attending students, so it's not going to be equalizing. I think that's like a really important takeaway. Opt-in is not, like, if you give people access is not equitable, like just by making it opt-in. You really have to think more strong, think more about how to get it to students. It's concentrated in math, and there's some evidence that schools can have an effect. Yeah.
Is it a gender gap in asking about in math?
Is there a gender gap?
In math, just math.
In math. That's a good question. I don't know for this particular, I can look it up because I have prior tests, even though there was no tests in this year. In general, girls score a little higher in math on average than boys do in the US in general. So not at the very, very top. I think we'll talk that the very, very top boys do better, but the average is actually now better for girls, I believe.
Question about, maybe I missed this, but about the tutor, what are tutors, and if there is like times where you can text in the bot, like. Yeah,
it's actually 24 hours a day that you can text them and they will respond. So this is a very big company and they have it 24 hours.
Tutors are from that company. It's high private company.
It's a big company that employs tutors full time to do this across districts in the US and in Canada. It's actually a Canadian company.
Yeah. So at the top, students only log on once that they're counting.
Yeah.
Does this mean that even among those Q rates you log on, most say, okay, this is nothing for me, so this is not really.
Right, exactly. So one of the questions is maybe it's not any good. So I'm going to use the nudges to try to tell you that it's actually looks like it could be helpful if people took it up. Oh, actually most of it, well, because this was during the pandemic, a lot of kids were at home anyway. Most of the take-up is basically during the school day, between like 9 and 5. But there is some take-up late at night. Yeah.
Do you have any idea if this is because the higher achieving students know when they have a problem, and the lower achieving students have a harder time figuring out what they need help for?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, I think maybe that could be part of it. My own guess is that higher achieving students are more interested in see themselves more as students and seek out help. One of the reasons they're higher achieving. Okay, so the second question is, can we increase take-up with nudges? And basically what we found is yes, we could. And not student nudges, but students and parents together increased take-up by about 46%. So it did actually do quite a bit to increase students ever logging on. It increased students and parents increased ever logging on. Sorry, I'm moving through this quickly. We tested this in a lot of, like just you would in any of these kinds of RCTs with controls and not with controls. But students and parents affect whether you logged on, the number of sessions you logged on to, and the number of messages exchanged. So it weren't huge effects, but they did quite affect it. So the first one doesn't have any controls, so that's a little bit easier to see. Here's the 18.7% from the control group. You get another 9% from parents and teachers. Parents and students. 6% with students alone, and 0 just with parents alone, and 0 just with students. Yeah.
Maybe you're going to say that they can more equal.
Yeah, actually they did. I am going to say that a little bit. Did I have that here? So the nudges to students and parents, if you had a D or an F, so you basically failed before versus you not failing before, it got you up to higher than the non-nudged ones that were higher achieving. So it did actually close the gap a little bit by doing this nudging. I think given the variation across schools, that it could be more effective if we were nudging teachers or schools to get this done, but nudging parents increased it quite a bit. And this was just showing that it was pretty similar with males and females. You can see males are lower, but you got this same kind of picture going on. Similarly with non-eligible, so poor, not poor, poor, even though these are kind of, at this stage, these are not that different, these groups, but you see a little bit, just because the ones who aren't eligible are probably very close to being eligible who are not here. Non-special ed versus special ed. Special ed take-up's a little lower, but with both you nudged them and it got higher. The take-up is much higher in Spanish versus English households. Okay. Nothing by message type. We have one significant thing negative for accountability, but I don't believe that.
Maybe you are answering my question. So I was wondering, if you look into the nature of the message that the kids exchange with the tutors, whether it's really subject matters that they discuss or motivational aspects that they tackle in the message.
Oh, that's a good question. We have not looked at the actual messages except for subject matter, so I don't know. But we could do that. Okay, so then that was, can we increase it? Yes. And does take up of it, is it associated with student learning gains? And so the first thing we did was just like, do kids, if we control for their prior scores and stuff like that, does it look like it makes a difference for them just with the descriptive data? And basically, for those with the lowest grade point average, you do see that the ones who take it up end up doing better. Similarly, the low attendance ones, the one who takes it up tends to do better just with lots of controls in there. And it is a lot of controls, but what we aren't controlling for is kind of the unpredicted school engagement. And since this is during the pandemic, maybe we're not controlling for shocks to students or something like that. So instead, what we tried to do is to use the variation from the nudges to get at this. So basically, the first stage of an IV for ever logging on would be, were you nudged to log on? It's not the strongest, even though we got a big effect. This is over a very, it's still not a huge number of kids who logged on a lot, but the first stage, parents, just like you thought, would get 6%, the parents get 9%, you've got an F of about 10 for the first stage. And the second stage actually is positive. So again, these are not the best outcome measures. We have, did they pass all courses, what their overall GPA is and what their math GPA is. And we do find a positive effect, particularly on the math GPA. It looks like a little too big to be true, but nonetheless, and this has all these controls in it, so the constant doesn't really mean very much. I should give you one of those, that was just a mistake that I saw that I had this and I didn't have this. You can see this table isn't in its prettiest form yet, so I need a new table there. But we do have some indications from this that it had some positive effects. Okay, so what did we learn? I think what we learned from this, and again, this is like one little RCT in this kind of research agenda that we've put together, and it happened during the pandemic, so not ideal, but I think what we've learned is that opt-in programs on their own will only serve a small group of students, which likely means small average effects. More engaged students are more likely to pick it up, and I think this will increase inequality instead of reduce it. And so we want to really think about this idea that opt-in is equalizing, which I think many districts are thinking like, oh, I'll just give it to everybody. And in fact, many of these programs don't charge very much for them, and so this is a really easy thing, but their financial model is basically that nobody takes it up. And so that's why they can charge so little. Schools vary substantially in take-up, suggesting that schools may have leverage to improve take-up. So if you've got a strong program like this one, maybe schools can get people to use it who would benefit from it. We haven't tried to kind of figure how we might incentivize that. Nudges to families increase use, but nudges to students alone don't. And students who participate do better, controlling for prior achievement and attendance and initial evidence that increases from nudging led to gains. We may need more relationship-based drivers for tutoring really to matter, but this is some evidence that you can even have effects if you can get them to go. So maybe the relationship part of tutoring is really just getting them to show up. So that's another question. But we need some causal evidence based on a larger variation in use. So basically, it's gained a little understanding in this kind of model of can we do research in the process right now where we really need the kind of research that we do in order to figure out what to do in this kind of moment of great need, essentially. So overall, this is a work in progress. Scaling is happening. So 65% of state plans for what they're going to do to address the pandemic-related learning loss have tutoring. So it's really kind of of course, it doesn't all come from the work that we've been doing to get it out there, but because we see because we've worked with so many of these states, it really shows that like, if we take what we do and try to do that translation, it can be effective. I think it's an indication on a broader thing that there are multiple avenues to thinking about scaling that aren't all about how good the intervention is. And so we have to think about more than how good an intervention is if we want to really think about how to scale something that we find is effective. There's a need for infrastructure for scaling, including state policies and school models. One of the things that I didn't say is this has been much more effective to scale in school models that already had like an intervention period in them. So that already had time for students to do something different than every student doing the same thing in their coursework, and in models that had more adults in schools. So they're not in, about half the adults in schools in the US are teachers. There's a whole other half of the adults in schools that aren't teachers. Places that had more of the kind of para-educators are more able to do this. So trying to think about whether, and I think this is a really interesting question for us in general right now, is whether there are labor market things, whether there are changes in the human capital for schools that could be beneficial instead of like every class being the same size and taught by the same kind of teacher with the same experience and pay. The last is that research linked directly to current policy is fun. Okay, if you're interested, it's studentswordaccelerator.org where all our stuff is. Thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions. 5 minutes, okay.
I'm wondering a lot about this variation in schools and makeup.
Yeah.
I mean, do you have any sense of what it might be? Is it truly just your educators walking around saying, don't get your tutoring, or is it something bigger? Is it something
I think it's mostly driven by the principals. At least that's what the districts, or that's what the charter management says, that some of the principals said, this is really a useful tool for us, so I'm going to kind of encourage my teachers to have their students use it. So I think that's, I don't have any proof, but that's what, yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Silvia Gisela from Mukul. I just have a question. I don't know if maybe you have the outcome to study that, but I was wondering whether these tutoring programs are effective in recovering all the loss, not only performance, but also whether the students that attend this tutoring can then put into a classroom with 20 students and then they continue to learn, or rather these tutoring programs are kind of like spoon-feeding the students and then they may not be able to get in track.
Yeah, so there's a really good study out of the University of Chicago that Jens Ludwig and John Gurian did of a tutoring program called Saga. And it worked with some of the lowest achieving kids in the Chicago schools. And it was in math, in algebra, there it was high school math. And they found effects not only on the math achievement, which was a huge effect. It was about two years of additional learning for 1 year. And it was really, I think, cool because there's a general sense, we have to intervene really early because you can't affect high school kids. This really affected high school kids. But it also affected their attendance at school and their performance in other classes. So it was really, I mean, I really think that a lot of this is students realizing that they can be successful in school. And so then that makes them see, oh, this isn't so bad. And that's why, like, my guess is that a lot of the benefit, again, comes from this relationship and from mentoring. But if you've got mentoring tied to the academics, then the student realizes that school can be okay for them. And so I think that tie to the academics is very important, as well as the relationship. Yeah.
I'm wondering if including one way to increase makeup would be more personal or social aspect of the tutoring. So to have at least one introductory Zoom session where students would have a face and a voice to interact with, so I can see how that looks.
Yeah. So I think in the non-opt-in ones, they've been able to do that. So a lot of the ones that have been effective, they go to a computer lab in school and they log on, even if it's virtual, they log on there and interact with them. I don't know how much that would help here in these opt-in programs. I mean, I guess it might help some. Anecdotally, there's this group called Amplify, which started some tutoring, and their experience was that kids were more likely during the pandemic to show up for tutoring than they were to show up for their classes. Because again, there's this kind of social aspect to it that they were disengaged. So I think there is something to that. My guess is the best way to do it is to require tutoring, to actually build it and require it in school. But it could be that you could increase opt-in through somehow building that relationship first. So maybe having a few times with the same tutor, so you have a relationship, and then allowed to be opted after that. Actually, we're trying to test that in one of the things right now by having it's a platform-based program where you can schedule with the same tutor. So, and we're going to try to have the tutors try to schedule with that student again after they've had one meeting to have another one, and see if you can build something with opt-in that way. But I don't know right now.
Yeah, following up on that question, do you think other incentives that would help taking out the
Yeah, there is no way for me to like really know if kind of buying students time in some ways to go there will do that. Again, I think the best way to do it is to actually build it into their schedule and make sure that they get it that way, which is what the group like Saga did, and some of the other ones, particularly for early reading, do. It is possible that we can incentivize people for opt-in so it isn't as unequalizing as opt-in generally is, but I think it's not ideal if our goal is to reduce inequalities overall.
Last question?
There was some, yeah.
You said that it was taken up more in schools with more staff. What's the mechanism there? Is it always a built-in program, or are those extra staff being used in some way to implement these tutoring programs?
Yeah, there being some, so they've shifted some of their roles. They were able to say, well, instead of having these extra staff here that do breakout groups within a class or who are on the playground or something like that, we're going to use them for the tutoring. So I think that is part of it. It's just these are schools. We've got something called response to intervention for special education in the U.S., which is kind of an approach where you try different things for different kids and see how it works. Schools that have that often have more staff. What's interesting is my argument is that we need to differentiate the educator workforce and have some slightly lower paid teachers in there with less experience and stuff like that. That could be a pipeline to more experienced teachers and utilize that for this more individualized stuff. And I get a lot of pushback on it, but if what you think about is we had these two policies in the US that required specific educational interventions for special education and for English language learners. Once those policies went in kind of at the federal level, schools actually increased their paraprofessionals, this kind of group, hugely. So it's not like we haven't done this before, and some schools did it more than others. And so the schools that had already done it more than others were more likely to be able to put this in.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. So now we can move to the next section.
Yeah, so we're here, the other room is behind the reception basically.
Ok, la chiudiamo? Sento io. Allora, chiudo la comunicazione. Chiudo qua e ci sentiamo dopo, ok? Con l'altro link. Grazie. A dopo.